Canada, a longtime energy partner, has shut down the $103 billion oil export pipeline to the U.S., leaving Washington unable to respond in time. Canada stops supplying oil and gas to the U.S. Canada, the largest energy supplier to the U.S., shocked Washington with its decision to halt energy exports. This immediately caused a surge in gas, oil, and electricity prices in the U.S., leading to unprecedented disruptions in the lives of millions of Americans. How will Americans cope with the rising prices of essential goods, including fuel, food, and public services? From daily commutes to flights, everything is being affected. The aviation industry faces increased fuel costs, while transport, manufacturing, and many other sectors are struggling due to the soaring energy prices. The reason behind Canada's decision: for years, the U.S. has imposed heavy trade tariffs on Canadian goods, believing that its neighboring country wouldn't dare to retaliate. But that belief is now being shattered. Canada had long warned that this could happen, yet Washington paid little attention. Eventually, a strategic shift was made. Canada not only stopped oil exports to the U.S., but also signed long-term contracts with other countries, particularly China and India, the two largest energy markets in the world. This is not just a political reaction, but also a long-term economic strategy to reduce dependence on the U.S. With these new agreements, Canada has opened the door to becoming one of the leading energy suppliers for major global economies, Europe and Asia, ready to replace the U.S. So, when the U.S. suddenly loses its critical energy supply from Canada, who will step in to replace it? Europe and Asia have quickly stepped up. Canada has signed billion-dollar agreements to supply oil, gas, and electricity to countries in need of a stable energy source, especially Europe, which is seeking to replace energy supplies from Russia. At the same time, China and India have secured long-term agreements to ensure energy supplies for their rapidly growing economies. Canada's export ports and pipeline systems are now not only directed towards North America, but also shifting their energy flow towards Asia and Europe. This not only creates a massive shock for the U.S., but also completely changes the global energy balance. The U.S. now faces not only an energy crisis, but also loses its strategic position in the international energy competition. With the loss of hydroelectric supply from Canada, states like New York, California, and Michigan are facing the risk of rolling blackouts, especially during the winter months. Electricity prices have soared, and some regions are even considering implementing peak hour usage restrictions to avoid overloads. Major industries, such as automobile, steel, and food production, are starting to cut production due to rising energy costs. This not only impacts the economy, but also threatens tens of thousands of jobs, particularly in energy-dependent sectors. Many businesses are facing severe profits decline, with some even closing down certain production facilities. This is forcing Americans to witness significant changes in their daily lives. From prices to job opportunities, the energy winter approaches. You've probably noticed the U.S. is facing a challenging energy winter. Gas, oil, electricity, airline tickets, and goods have all surged in price. Families and businesses are shouldering unprecedented inflation, and everything is becoming more expensive than ever before. The electricity and fuel systems once dependent on Canada's supply are now paralyzed, rendering Washington's efforts almost futile. In reality, these events are forcing the U.S. economy to face a significant shock, and it's hard to predict what will happen next. How many options does the U.S. have left to deal with this crisis? Can Washington escape the energy crisis before it turns into a full-blown economic disaster?
Europe is ready to assume its responsibilities. Rearm Europe could mobilize close to 800 billion euros of defense expenditures for a safe and resilient Europe.
The EU has just announced an €800 billion program for Readiness 2030, marking a turning point where allies are turning away from U.S. weapons under Trump's leadership.
Several prominent voices linked to the defense establishment in Europe have suggested the U.S. has built so-called kill switches into the aircraft, which would allow Washington to remotely deactivate or limit the combat functions of.
Many countries around the world are beginning to doubt the safety and stability of using U.S. weapons. Concerns revolve around the possibility that the U.S. could disable weapons sold to its allies. For example, by stopping the supply of spare parts or activating a remote kill switch. This not only causes concern in countries purchasing U.S. weapons, but also serves as a wake-up call for America's strategic partners, as trust in the protection commitments from the Trump administration continues to decline. Rasmus Jarlov, the chairman of the Danish Defense Committee, has made a clear warning. We can no longer trust the U.S. He emphasized that purchasing weapons from the U.S. poses a significant risk to national security, especially in the context where the U.S. could use its allies' dependence on weapons as a tool of threat. Jarlov even expressed concerns that the U.S. could demand Greenland, and if Denmark refuses, they might disable Denmark's weapons and allow Russia to attack. But a serious warning about the potential threats faced by countries that do not comply with U.S. demands. One of the biggest concerns is that the U.S. might sell its allies versions of weapons reduced by 10% in power. Trump himself openly stated at the White House that he would sell reduced power 10% versions of weapons to allied countries, as he believed overall.
Be selling them perhaps toned down versions. We like to tone them down about 10%, which probably makes sense because someday maybe they're not our allies, right?
This has led countries like Canada, Portugal, and France to reconsider their F-35 fighter jet orders, with some nations deciding to switch to purchasing weapons from European or Australian manufacturers. Not only countries outside of Europe, but even countries within the European Union are beginning to push back against the U.S.'s defense policies. With the Readiness 2030 program worth 800 billion euros, the EU is gradually shifting towards prioritizing weapons purchases from Europe, Japan, and South Korea.
Huge amount that we are offering now to member states or for joint procurement, 800 billion. So that's enormous. And therefore, I think we will focus now on delivering the legal proposals, which is...
They have decided to exclude the US and even the UK from their future defense plans. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen confirmed, "We need to prepare for a scenario where the US is no longer a strategic partner." This is a clear signal that the EU is no longer dependent on the US, but instead is building an independent defense force. Another sign of the shift in defense strategy is that Canada has decided to pivot towards Australia instead of continuing cooperation with the US. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a $6 billion Canadian cooperation project with Australia to develop the over-the-horizon long-range radar system. This is a significant change, showing that Canada is seeking other partners instead of relying on the US. Finally, we cannot overlook the puppy diplomacy tactic of the Trump administration in Greenland. Usha Vance, wife of Senator J.D. Vance, visited Greenland as an unofficial representative, angering the Danish people. They emphasized that Greenland has been part of Denmark since 1380, twice as long as the existence of the United States. No one in Greenland wants to become American. This is a significant challenge to U.S. foreign policy under Trump. The world is rising together against external pressures. From Mexico, Canada to Ukraine, how are they defending their sovereignty and freedom? International solidarity. In recent years, particularly under the Trump administration, countries have faced a series of new challenges to their sovereignty and democracy. From Mexico to Canada, no one is outside of this struggle. But one thing is clear. The world is uniting strongly to defend the right to self-determination and national sovereignty. We are witnessing a strong Mexico under the leadership of President Claudia Sheinbaum, who has gained absolute support from the people with an approval rating of up to 85% for her resolute defense of the country against external pressures. In the past 48 hours, more than 35,000 Mexican citizens have taken to the streets, not only to protest foreign government pressures, but also to affirm the freedom and independence of their nation. They will not allow outside decisions to impact their country. We cannot let the decisions of foreign governments affect us. Our sovereignty is non-negotiable, President Sheinbaum declared firmly. Canada and Europe stand united. To the north, Canada is no different. A country known for its peace policies and international cooperation is now facing a serious challenge. From former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien to new Prime Minister Mark Carney, all have spoken out strongly. Canadian leaders assert, Canada will never be part of the U.S. This is not just rhetoric. It is a national unity, as political parties in Canada, whether liberal, conservative, or New Democratic, all stand together to protect the country's sovereignty and oppose the decisions of an external power. When the U.S. government continues to impose trade measures that harm their economy, Canada is not just protecting its economy, but also safeguarding a vision for the future, an independent, strong nation. Across the Atlantic, European nations are not standing still. After the tensions caused by the Trump administration, from Brexit to trade agreements, Europe has sent a clear signal that they will not be subdued by any pressures. Leaders from France, Germany, Italy, and smaller nations have come together to form a united front. They not only oppose U.S. policies, but also actively collaborate with other nations to build a fairer global order. When talking about international solidarity, Ukraine cannot be ignored. While President Trump continues to downplay Ukraine's role and almost exclusively favors personal interests, Ukraine is demonstrating its strength of unity and resilience. Under the leadership of President Volodymyr Zelensky, the country not only stands firm against external challenges, but also garners strong international support. In a short period, support for President Zelensky has risen to nearly 70%, signaling that the people of Ukraine are united in the fight to protect their nation and defend democracy. Never in history has a U.S. administration faced such a strong international backlash as it does now. The Trump administration, with its conservative policies and actions deemed arrogant, has caused many nations to turn away, while people around the world seek a more equal and cooperative world. Trump continues to push countries into confrontation. Both large and small nations have started looking for ways to stand strong on their own, no longer easily influenced by Washington's unilateral decisions. In fact, Trump's international credibility has significantly declined. His abrupt decisions, from threatening to sever ties with long-standing allies to imposing harsh trade policies, have not only increased global dissatisfaction, but also exposed a lack of decisiveness in critical decisions. This has created a gap that cannot be bridged between the U.S. and the rest of the world, making the U.S. increasingly isolated on the international stage. Finally, the story from Greenland must be mentioned. The Trump administration had once made threats about buying Greenland, but the people there, from the government to local citizens, strongly opposed it. The Greenland government stated that they never wanted to become part of the U.S. They want to preserve their identity and sovereignty. This is a clear demonstration that, even under pressure, small countries can stand strong and protect their rights. Will small countries continue to stand strong? Or will we witness a major shift in global power? Stay tuned. For decades, the U.S. has dominated Canada's economy, with over 73% of Canada's exports flowing south. But for the first time in history, Canada is saying enough. Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister of Canada, has made it crystal clear: Canada will never be part of America. Is this the beginning of a full-scale trade war between the U.S. and its closest ally? The details coming up will shock you, so stay tuned. Mark Carney is not your typical politician. He's a world-class economist who steered Canada through the 2008 financial crisis as the governor of the Bank of Canada. Then, from 2013 to 2020, he led the Bank of England, helping the UK survive Brexit's economic chaos. Now, as Canada's Prime Minister, Carney is making his stance clear. Canada must break free from US economic control. Unlike his predecessors, Carney doesn't play politics. He plays with data, strategy, and hard facts. And that makes him a serious problem for Washington. In response to Trump's brutal 25% tariffs on Canadian steel, lumber, and auto parts, Carney is striking back. Instead of backing down, Canada is launching its own countermeasures, massive tariffs on U.S. goods, hitting key American industries, expanding trade with the EU and BRICS nations. To reduce reliance on the U.S., boosting domestic production, to replace U.S. imports, investing heavily in renewable energy to challenge U.S. oil dominance. If Canada succeeds, the U.S. will lose one of its most critical trade partners. And if other countries follow Canada's lead, this could trigger a major shift in the global economy. But Carney's fight isn't just about trade. He wants to change the entire global financial system. Back in 2019, at the Jackson Hole Economic Summit, Carney warned that the world was too dependent on the US dollar. He argued that countries shouldn't be at the mercy of the Federal Reserve's decisions, which impact inflation, interest rates, and markets worldwide. His solution? A new global currency system that reduces reliance on the US dollar. A central bank-backed digital currency that could replace the dollar in international trade. If Carney succeeds, the US could lose its biggest economic advantage, the power of the dollar, and that would change everything. The trade war between Mark Carney and Donald Trump is heating up, and it could change the future of North America's economy. Trump has hit Canada with heavy tariffs on steel, lumber, and agricultural products, aiming to pressure Canada into economic submission. But Prime Minister Mark Carney isn't backing down. He's expanding trade partnerships with the EU, BRICS, and other global markets to reduce dependence on the U.S. Carney is also pushing for less reliance on the U.S. dollar, calling for a new financial system where countries aren't at the mercy of American monetary policy. This move has Washington on high alert, with Trump and his allies viewing it as a direct threat to U.S. dominance. While Trump uses aggressive tariffs and economic leverage, Carney is playing the long game, building financial alliances to protect Canada from U.S. influence. If he succeeds, other nations may follow, potentially weakening America's global power. Markets are already reacting. With investors worried about prolonged economic instability, this isn't just about trade. It's a battle for control over North America's economic future. With neither side willing to back down, is the U.S. about to lose its strongest trading partner? Donald Trump is unpredictable, aggressive, and unapologetic. He's willing to burn bridges to get what he wants. Mark Carney, on the other hand, is strategic, calculated, and data-driven. He won't back down easily, and he's preparing Canada for a fight like never before. This battle isn't just about tariffs and exports. It's about the future of North America's economy. If Carney breaks free from U.S. economic dominance, other countries might follow his lead. So the real question is, can Trump stop Canada from walking away? Or is the U.S. about to lose its most loyal trading partner? Canada cuts power supply to the U.S.? Who will suffer the most? What happens if Canada stops supplying electricity and oil to the U.S.? Rising energy prices, widespread blackouts, a major shock to the U.S. economy? Canada is considering an unprecedented move, limiting electricity and oil exports in response to new U.S. tariffs. The root of the tension. This story begins with a decision from the U.S. government. Washington is set to impose a 25% tariff on Canadian imports, including energy. The move has sparked strong opposition from Canada, with the U.S. being Canada's largest export market. These tariffs could have significant negative effects on its economy, particularly in automobile manufacturing, steel production, and energy sectors. In response, Ontario, one of Canada's largest industrial hubs, is considering a drastic measure, cutting electricity supply to U.S. states that depend heavily on Canadian energy. But is this truly an effective counterattack or just a strategic warning? Potential impact on the U.S. Did you know that the U.S. imports nearly 40 terawatt-hours of electricity from Canada every year? States like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota are particularly dependent on this supply. If Canada cuts electricity exports, the U.S. power grid could face shortages, especially during peak seasons like summer and winter when energy demand surges. We're talking about higher electricity prices, the possibility of rolling blackouts, and major disruptions for industries reliant on cheap Canadian energy. And it's not just electricity. The U.S. imports 4 million barrels of oil per day from Canada, making up 67% of total U.S. oil imports. If Canada further limits oil exports, what challenges will the U.S. energy market face? Canada's strategy. Going beyond electricity exports? Cutting electricity is just one option on Canada's table. The country is also considering reducing oil, natural gas, and even rare earth mineral exports, resources that are critical to the U.S. economy. So, does Canada have other options beyond the U.S.? Yes. Canada has been expanding its energy markets to Asia, particularly China and Japan. With the completion of the Trans Mountain Expansion, TMX pipeline in 2024, Canada can now export oil in larger quantities to non-U.S. markets. What does this mean? If trade tensions escalate, Canada could redirect its exports, leaving the U.S. scrambling for alternative energy sources. Can the U.S. survive without Canadian energy? If Canada cuts its energy exports, can the U.S. quickly find alternative sources to fill the gap? In theory, the U.S. has large domestic energy reserves, but there's a problem. Many American refineries are designed to process Canada's heavier crude oil, and switching to other suppliers like Venezuela or the Middle East isn't an overnight fix. Additionally, ramping up domestic oil production takes time, infrastructure, and investment. Meanwhile, Natural gas imports from Canada remain critical for heating and industrial use, especially in the Midwest and Northeast. When it comes to electricity, things get even more complicated. Canada's power exports are deeply integrated into the U.S. grid, meaning that losing this supply could cause regional instability. So, could the U.S. simply buy energy elsewhere? Theoretically, yes, but at much higher costs. Replacing Canadian power with domestic or imported alternatives would likely drive up prices, affecting businesses, industries, and millions of American households. With this in mind, can the U.S. afford to risk this energy dispute, or will both sides be forced back to the negotiating table before the damage becomes irreversible? Can the U.S. easily find replacements for Canadian oil and electricity, or will this become a long-term shock to the U.S. economy?